Lord, teach me to pray when the whole world bleeds. The voice could barely be heard above the roar of cannons. The air smelled of gunpowder and despair. On the battlefield of the American Civil War, a young Methodist chaplain knelt beside a wounded soldier, a blood-stained Bible in his hands. His name was Edward McKendry Bounds, 25 years old, a lawyer turned pastor. While others fought with weapons, he fought with tears. Among groans and smoke, he understood that no prayer is small when heaven is the only trench. Years later, Bounds would rise before the sun. For nearly 50 years. 3-4 hours of intercession before the world awakened. His books would cross continents, shaping preachers like Ravenhill, Hyde, and Murray. But it all began here, in this chaos. A man discovering that God's presence is more real than the sound of war. Because nations fall, but the knees that bend sustain the world. But before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story sets your heart ablaze, subscribe now. Every week we bring new heroes of the faith. Stay until the end, because you'll discover how a man in the midst of war taught generations to fight on their knees. The same God who heard Bounds still ignites hearts with fire. The boy was born in 1835 in Shelbyville, Missouri, when America was still a land of dust and promises. The house was simple, made of rough wood, surrounded by fields that changed color with each season. His father was a respected civic leader, serving as justice of the peace and local authority, and expected his son to follow in his footsteps. But Edward McKendry Bounds grew up with another kind of restlessness. While the village boys played in the sun, he would retreat to the woods, drawn by the distant sound of church bells. There was something in that melody that made him stop, close his eyes, and whisper, without quite understanding why, a kind of prayer. Years later, as a teenager, Bounds studied law. He was brilliant, persuasive, respected. Very young, he was admitted to the bar and began working at the local courthouse. The papers on the desk were cold, the cases full of human pride. But inside him, a silent flame asked for something more. Sometimes, while reading petitions by lamplight, he would catch himself praying without realizing it. The sound of the pen scratching paper mixed with the echo of his soul asking, "What if I'm arguing the wrong causes?" It was then that he heard about a small Methodist revival shaking the American South. Ordinary men were being transformed. Simple women, filled with the Spirit, prayed until dawn. Curious, Bounds went to observe, just to watch, like someone analyzing a case. But that night, when an elderly preacher quoted the words of Isaiah, "Whom shall I send?" something broke inside him. Bounds never forgot that moment. It was as if God was calling him not to argue, but to surrender. He left the courthouse shortly after. Colleagues laughed, called him a fanatic, but he didn't defend himself. He simply gathered his law books and, in silence, began studying the scriptures. He exchanged his dark suit for simple clothes and began walking from town to town, preaching in small wooden churches. His ministry began without brilliance, but with tears, and every sermon always ended the same way. Him kneeling in silence, waiting for God to speak before the people rose. It was during this time that the discipline began. Bounds would wake before sunrise, even without an alarm. The first breath was prayer. The first word, gratitude. Then he would walk to the woods, and there, among the dew and birdsong, seek God's voice. One morning, as the sky brightened, he wrote in his journal, "If man wants to see the face of God, he must learn to wait until the earth falls asleep and heaven awakens." But not everyone understood. Some said he was isolating himself too much. Others called him a dreamer. But Bounds knew that prayer wasn't refuge, it was preparation. Silence was the hammer with which God shaped his soul. Then came the war, and everything he believed would be tested. When the conflict between North and South erupted in 1861, Bounds was called to serve as chaplain in the Confederate Army. He hesitated. He didn't want to carry weapons, but felt he should be among the wounded men, those who suffered and died without hope. He departed carrying only a Bible, a notebook, and a conviction. The intercessor's duty is to remain where the fire is most intense. In the first months, the scenes marked him deeply. The smell of blood, the soldiers' screams, the earth trembling beneath the cannons. Bounds spent entire nights beside the wounded, praying for each one, even when their breath was already failing. Many mocked. "Praying for corpses now?" He responded with tear-filled eyes, "I will pray until the last breath finds mercy." But something still troubled him. In the midst of that senseless war, he began to question, where is God when the righteous fall? That question would accompany him for years, and it would be the root of all his books. One day, during a surprise attack, Bounds was captured along with a group of soldiers. They took him to a prison camp for refusing to swear loyalty, without a Bible, without paper, without a voice, only his own prayers. And there, between mud walls and cutting cold, he made the vow that would change everything. "Lord, if you ever set me free, I will spend the rest of my life teaching men to pray." No one imagined that this silent vow would cross generations, that from the ruins of that war would emerge one of the greatest masters of intercession the world has ever known. But before that, he still needed to be broken, because God doesn't anoint intact vessels. And the next season of his life would prove that the man who prays with power is always the man who learned to suffer with faith. The prison camp was a swamp. Rain fell without ceasing, turning the earth into thick mud. Bounds shared a wooden shelter with other soldiers. There were no mattresses, no blankets. Food was scarce, a piece of hard bread, a bowl of thin broth. But what hurt most wasn't the cold, it was the silence, God's silence. Days turned into weeks, without a Bible, without congregation, without news of the war, only the memory of scriptures he had stored in his heart. Sometimes he would repeat verses in a low voice, like someone rekindling a flame about to go out. "Though the fig tree does not bud, the Lord is close to the broken-hearted." But one thought haunted him. Does God still hear prayers behind bars? One night, a soldier beside him became delirious with fever. Bounds tore a piece from his own clothes and moistened it with the little water he had. While caring for him, he prayed, without words, only tears. The next morning, the man was alive. And it was there, before that silent miracle, that Bounds understood. Prayer is the only remedy that time and death cannot prevent. After that, he began praying for everyone, for enemies and friends, for guards and prisoners. The others began calling him the camp preacher, but he didn't preach, he only prayed, entire days, kneeling in the mud. While wind pierced through the cracks, he whispered, "If I cannot speak to the world, I will speak to heaven." It was also during this time that he learned the power of silence, the power to listen without asking, to wait without understanding. Years later, he would write, "Those who listen more than they speak are those who move the heart of God." When the war ended, Bounds was freed. He left with a weak body but a burning spirit. He carried a certainty. God had kept him alive not to preach better, but to pray deeper. Back in Tennessee, he found his city devastated. Burned houses, divided families, empty churches. The country was bleeding, and he knew what to do. He began meeting with small groups of believers, teaching them to pray with fervor, not formality. At first, few showed up. But when he prayed, something changed in the atmosphere. People wept without knowing why. Hardened men knelt down. Bounds rarely raised his voice. His power was in persistence. Hours before dawn, he was already in his room, kneeling, seeking the same God who had sustained him in prison. He didn't pray for minutes, he prayed for hours, 3, 4, sometimes 5, and only then would he open the Bible. He said that prayer was the key and the word the door. Prayer without the word is fire without fuel, he once noted, and the word without prayer is a lamp without flame. But this life of discipline had a price. His health began to decline. The cold dawns left him feverish. Friends asked him to rest. He smiled, weary, and responded, "I will rest when there are no more souls needing intercession." The ministry flourished. Bounds preached at revivals, mentored pastors, wrote notes and prayers in simple notebooks. He didn't seek fame, he sought fire. The newspapers barely mentioned him, but those who saw him pray knew there was something different about this man. He spoke with God like someone conversing with a friend just inches away. One dawn, during a retreat at a small rural church, Bounds remained in prayer until sunrise. A young pastor, curious, watched him hidden. When the sun broke the horizon, Bounds opened his eyes and whispered, "His presence is better than sleep." That phrase would mark the young man for the rest of his life. Years later, he would become one of the great revival leaders in the South. Even so, Bounds struggled with loneliness. His wife had fallen ill and died young. He was left a widower, caring for his children with help from church brothers and sisters. But he never murmured. His journal shows only one line, written days after the loss. "Prayer is the thread that keeps me tied to heaven when earth cuts my hands." It was also during this phase that he began writing systematically about the power of prayer. Each chapter was born from a dawn, each sentence from a tear. While many wrote treatises, Bounds wrote testimonies. His pages didn't explain, they burned. However, few knew. Many of his books would only be published after his death. But he never cared. He used to say, "Time is God's editor," and he never delays the printing of his plans. By then, E.M. Bounds was already a pilgrim of God's presence. He slept little, ate little, spoke little. But when he prayed, it seemed the very air grew dense. Men entered his house asking for advice and left in silence weeping, not because of words, but because they felt the same God who visited that room every dawn. War, prison, and pain had done what no sermon could, transform a lawyer into an eternal intercessor. And he knew it wasn't the end yet. The greatest prayers of his life and the greatest impact were still to come. The following years were a prolonged dawn. The war had ended, but Bounds continued fighting, now in another field, invisible. He no longer wore a uniform, but his dawns still sounded like trenches. While the country rebuilt cities, he rebuilt altars. In the 1880s, he served in St. Louis, Missouri. The congregation was modest, weary, without spiritual enthusiasm. Bounds didn't begin with strategies. He began with prayer. For months before each service, he spent 2 hours kneeling in the church basement. Some considered him eccentric, others imitated him in silence. And gradually, something began to change. People arrived saying they felt a holy weight in the air. Hardened men confessed sins. Women prayed in tears, and what had been a sleeping church became a flame. Bounds observed everything without exalting himself. He knew that true revival doesn't begin in the pulpit, but in the secret chamber. Prayer is the invisible fire that heats words until they become light, he wrote in his notebook. During this period, he also served as associate editor of the Methodist newspaper St. Louis Christian Advocate, 1877-1880. There, he learned to transform experience into words and words into testimony. His notes began to grow, multiplying into stacks of pages. He didn't think about publishing. He wrote like someone breathing, like someone afraid of forgetting what he heard from God in the darkness. Years earlier, he had faced the pain of loss. His wife had fallen ill and departed early. For a time, The home fell silent. But in 1887, God gave him new breath. Bounds married again to Hattie Barnett. She shared the same burning faith, and the house once again had children's laughter and even longer prayers at dawn. It was in this new season that he began organizing his manuscripts in an orderly way. Notebooks stained with ink, pages yellowed by moisture, excerpts from sermons and prayers written by lamplight. The Spirit urged him, "Record what you have seen in secret." And he obeyed. Books were born like the power through prayer and praying men, and the weapon of prayer. On each page, the same theme: God acts through bent knees. He didn't write theories, he wrote from life. Each paragraph was a memory of prison, of cold, of loss, of the altar. And yet there was no bitterness, only reverence. No one knew that these writings would only be discovered and organized after his death. But in that time, Bounds only wrote and prayed. The rest he left in God's hands. One morning, a young preacher named Homer W. Hodge visited him. Bounds, then over 60 years old, was sitting by the window reviewing his notes. The young man asked, "Reverend, why do you insist on writing if so few read?" Bounds raised his eyes serene and responded, "Because perhaps those who need to read haven't been born yet." That phrase would become prophecy. Decades later, Hodge would be responsible for preserving and disseminating his posthumous writings. But in that present, Bounds lived in anonymity. His services were simple, his clothes worn, his house modest. Nothing about him drew attention, except the brightness in his eyes when he spoke of prayer. It was the brightness of someone who had seen God and survived to tell about it. There would still be opposition. Some leaders criticized him, saying he talked too much about prayer and little about action. Bounds responded calmly, "Prayer is the action that moves all others." And he would kneel again. The decades accumulated like pages. He aged, but his faith did not. White hair, tired body, but the same routine. Wake at 4, kneel, cry out. No day is safe without prayer, and he said, no soul is mature without fire. On one of his last trips, he preached at a small pastors' conference. He spoke for only 20 minutes. But when he finished, no one stood up. The silence was dense. Men wept discreetly. One of those present wrote afterward, "It seemed as if the Holy Spirit himself was praying through him." It was the apex and the beginning of twilight. Bounds would return home weakened but at peace. He continued writing until the end, surrounded by notebooks, candles, and unanswered prayers. And it was there, between papers and sighs, that he wrote his last known line, "Heaven still waits for men who will let themselves be consumed." That phrase would cross the century. His words would influence missionaries in India, preachers in England, revivalists in the United States. Books translated into dozens of languages. Thousands of readers per generation. And all of this from a man who died almost forgotten. But the true impact cannot be counted in numbers. It can be felt every time someone kneels, remembering that God still hears. This story is not just an ancient testimony, it's a call. E.M. Bounds prayed in the midst of war so that faith would survive in times of peace. If every Christian who hears this story decides to pray for one person today, thousands of hearts could awaken. Share this video now. Send it to your church group, your family, your intercessors, because the same God who answered Bounds still waits for someone willing to fight on their knees. But no one knew that the next morning would be the last he would see, and that words written in silence would become the roar of an entire century. The body was weak, but the spirit awake. It was 1913. E.M. Bounds lived in Washington, Georgia, in a simple house, surrounded by books, old notes, and the same silence that had accompanied him his entire life. He was 77 years old and still rose before the sun. The cough awakened him, his body ached, but his heart insisted on praying. One morning, a friend found him kneeling and said, "Reverend, you need to rest." Bounds smiled, his voice hoarse, and responded, "If I cannot pray on my knees, I will pray lying down, but I will pray." That dawn, he prayed longer than usual. Shortly after, when sunrise came, he was found at peace. The Bible lay open beside him, the window letting in soft light on his serene face. Thus he departed, without fanfare, without crowds, without farewells. Just a man and the God he had served. When Homer Hodge, his disciple and friend, entered the room, he saw stacks of notebooks on the table, thousands of handwritten pages, prayers, sermons, scattered thoughts, promises. He understood that those pages could not die with the author. He gathered each sheet like someone collecting embers still glowing. Years later, Reverend Claude L. Chilton Jr. would prepare and edit these manuscripts, lighting a flame that would reach across centuries. Among the first posthumous editions, The Power Through Prayer didn't have great sales, but the few who read it were never the same again. Pastors copied it by hand. Missionaries carried it in suitcases to distant fields. Each sentence carried the same weight as the knees that wrote it. God shapes the world by the prayers of his saints. That line, written in silence, would cross oceans and awaken generations. Decades later, his books would be translated into dozens of languages. They would influence Leonard Ravenhill, Andrew Murray, John Hyde, Oswald Chambers, Billy Graham, and so many others who would rekindle the altar of prayer in the following century. But Bounds never saw that fruit. He died without knowing his name would become synonymous with intercession. For him, what mattered wasn't being remembered, but that God was heard. Fame is an echo that dies. Prayer is a sound that reaches the throne, and the echo arrived. More than a century later, millions still read his words. In churches, schools, devotional seminaries, on each page the same conviction: the most powerful church is the one that prays the most. He had proven this in war, in prison, in pain, and in loneliness. And now, dead, he still preached, with the fire of words that the Spirit had ignited in life. His story reminds us of three eternal truths. First, God hears persistent prayer even when heaven seems distant. Second, God uses ordinary people, not the most talented but the most broken. And third, immediate obedience releases heavenly power. Each dawn he chose to pray instead of sleep, moved invisible lines on history's map, because prayer is the greatest act of faith, speaking to a God you cannot see and living as if you've already been heard. And now, the call turns to us. What have you been praying for years? What has God asked and you have postponed? Perhaps it's not preaching, nor traveling, nor writing books. Perhaps it's just bending your knees for someone the world forgot. Bounds began with tears, and those tears became rivers. God doesn't look for eloquent voices. He looks for surrendered hearts. He doesn't need famous men. He needs men who pray. And perhaps the next name heaven writes will be yours. Don't wait to be ready. Bounds wasn't either. He simply began, kneeling in the midst of war. And from there, God raised up an intercessor who set generations ablaze. The next one could be you. Start praying. Pray until the cold of indifference breaks. Pray until someone's name returns to your memory. Pray until heaven moves. Because every revival begins when a man or woman refuses to rise before God speaks. The same fire that burned in Bounds still blazes, waiting for a new altar. And perhaps that altar is inside your chest. From an ambitious lawyer to an eternal intercessor, that's God's mathematics when he finds obedience. Subscribe now. Every week we bring new heroes of the faith, men and women who were bent by God and refused to be extinguished. If this story spoke to your heart, write in the comments what God reminded you through the life of E.M. Bounds. Perhaps your words will awaken someone who also needs to remember that there is still power when someone kneels. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and faith-filled stories to lives that still need to be reached. But if you can't, pray for us, because no offering keeps this ministry more alive than the prayers of the saints. And before we close, if you wish to walk with us through more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. It's not about videos, it's about keeping alive the flame of those who still believe that God moves when someone kneels. May the same Christ who taught E.M. Bounds to pray in the midst of war teach you also to seek heaven in times of peace. And may, through you, this flame reach hearts that still wait to hear God's voice in the silence.